History has been written and rewritten by the actions of individuals who dared challenge the social order, but sacrifice must be made for progress to occur. It is never easy, in the words of Dr. King, for the oppressed to demand freedoms from their oppressors. 1968, Mexico City. The world order was irrevocably changed as three men took a stand against the social injustices that permeated every aspect of their lives. Fate brought these individuals together, but it was their decision to act that made them legend. Tommie Smith, the poor farm boy from Texas who dreamed and worked towards bigger things. John Carlos, the Robin Hood of Harlem who stole food and clothing to help the destitute. And Peter Norman, the Australian who grew up disregarding race differences in a country that didn't. Tommie Smith was born to a poor family in Texas and a life imbued with segregation. At Central Union Elementary, he first discovered his love for the fresh wind and the touch of the victory tape. When he approached his father for permission to run at school, Smith received a grudging affirmation. If you run and you get second place, you'll have to be back in the field with the rest of us next Saturday. Flash forward to college at San Jose State. Tommie Smith found himself studying to stay far away from those fields. John Carlos grew up in a working-class family in Harlem, driving rich whites to the Savoy Ballroom and hustling money on the side. His success on the track began when he replaced an injured relay runner on his high school track team. Before then, his only training was fleeing from the law to deliver goods he stole for the poor. After high school, Carlos moved to East Texas State University, where he experienced real segregation for the first time. Peter Norman grew up in the suburbs of Melbourne, watching Australia's Aborigines fight for a place in society. Both parents were avid members of the Salvation Army, who taught their son to respect people, regardless of race, color, or background. There was a social injustice that I couldn't do anything about from where I was, but I certainly hated it, said Norman. The 1960s was one of the most turbulent decades in history. Minorities fought for equality as the world teetered on the brink of a social revolution. In America, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were gaining strength, and the Black Power movement was building steam right alongside. These clashing ideals and the widening social divide sparked brutal race riots across the country. African Americans participated in nonviolent protests, ranging from community sit-ins to massive marches. On the other side of the world, Australia was witness to an equally horrid display of social injustice. Aborigines were denied citizenship and stripped of their children, who were sent to grow up with white parents. This event was known as the Stolen Generation, the repercussions of which are still felt today. Aboriginal rights were first discussed in 1967 when a federal council met to right wrongs and vote yes for Aborigines. Citizens longing for change in both America and Australia took part in freedom rides to challenge the oppression faced by minorities and draw attention to the cause of desegregation. It was no secret that something revolutionary was going to happen at the 1968 Olympic Games, with waves of outrage triggered by the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. still crashing upon the nation and racial unrest at its zenith. Black athletes had a critical decision to make. Several leading proponents for civil rights, including San Jose State's Professor Harry Edwards, pushed for a complete African-American boycott of the Olympics.
I've always been a scholar activist because I believe that activism without scholarship is a formula for chaos and confusion.
One goal of this boycott was to protest the readmittance of apartheid South Africa into the Olympic Games until the country had been reformed. As Carlos put it, if South Africa was in, we were out. However, the Olympic boycott was eventually dropped, a decision that was heavily shaped by the rebanning of South Africa in April of 1968. Many also didn't want to let go of a chance to break records and make history, but no one knew just how much history was about to be made. Tensions were high in Mexico City as the games of the 19th Olympiad finally drew near. Students raged in the streets as the government poured funds into the Olympic Stadium, neglecting the poor who were living in squalor on its doorstep. The nonviolent protests took a violent turn when the state military began firing on students in Tlatelolco Square to make Mexico City appear more presentable. This bloodshed was not mentioned once throughout the games, with the government later proclaiming fewer than 30 victims. The real number was in the hundreds. Carlos later expressed that they, not Tommie and me, were the true Olympic martyrs and must never be forgotten. The 1968 Olympics would go down in history. Enriqueta Basilio became the first woman to light the Olympic flame in shining televised color. Bob Beamon crushed the existing long jump record by 21 inches, and Dick Fosbury revolutionized high jump with his Fosbury flop. Then came the 200-meter final. Americans Tommie Smith and John Carlos were the crowd favorites, expected to tear up the track. And tear they did, but they weren't alone. Smith charged his way to gold, but Australian Peter Norman outleaned Carlos for second place.
There's Questad. It's a good start. And Carlos, as usual, has burst out of the blocks. Tommy Smith running pretty well so far. And in lane 2, Bombuk is strong on the outside. It's Edwin Roberts. It's John Carlos right now. It's Carlos and Smith. And here comes Tommy Smith. Smith has done it.
4 days into the games of the 19th Olympiad, and all was quiet. No demonstration for human rights had been carried out until Tommy Smith won gold in the men's 200-meter final, and events were set into motion. At the medal ceremony, mankind was rocked by the silent gesture heard round the world. With the national anthem playing, Smith and Carlos bowed their heads and raised a gloved fist. Peter Norman stood unwavering at their side, proudly wearing an Olympic Project for Human Rights badge. Remarkably, this gesture was only planned when Smith and Carlos realized they would both be making an appearance on the Olympic dais. It was Norman who suggested they split a pair of gloves, and Norman who chose to wear the Human Rights badge. Carlos expected to see fear in Peter Norman's eyes before the medal ceremony, when there was no turning back from what they were about to do. But he didn't see fear. "I saw love," he said. Whenever Norman was asked about his decision to support the two black athletes, he gave a very simple answer: "I believe in human rights." As Carlos later stated, sadly, many people misinterpreted our silent protest as a protest for black power, rather than a protest for human rights for all people throughout the world. The black clenched fist was not a symbol of dominance, but one of unity and strength. The two men also wore a simple strand of beads to illustrate the history of black lynchings, and were barefoot except for black socks to show that so many people of color here in the United States were running around in poverty every day. Their stance was supported by various athletes, including the American rower Paul Hoffman, who decided that if a white Australian was going to ask for an Olympic Project for Human Rights badge, then by God he would have one. Others, however, were not so understanding. International Olympic Committee President Avery Brundage gave the American Olympic team a brutal ultimatum: remove Smith and Carlos or the entire track and field team would be expelled from the remainder of the games. Brundage stated that Smith and Carlos' stance was a deliberate and violent breach of the fundamental principles of the Olympic spirit. The two men were dismissed from the games. The years following were long and unforgiving for all three men. This was Carlos' best year in running, but he was forced to give up his passion for a job with a steady income. After he lost his wife to depression, Carlos briefly tried football, but gave that up as well to start a new family in California. Smith also faced catastrophic consequences. Everywhere he sought help, he found only closed doors and turned backs. Like Carlos, he discovered a brief reprieve playing football, but was cut after 3 seasons. His marriage ended shortly after his football career, and when Smith's mother died, he left California and his old life. Meanwhile, Australia's fastest sprinter, who still holds their 200-meter record today, was never allowed to run in the Olympics again. Australia had turned against him. Carlos put it best when he said, "If we were getting beat up, Peter was facing an entire country and suffering alone." For many years, Norman had one chance to save himself, condemn his co-sprinters. Yet Norman never denounced the action of the two Americans. Instead, he always held that he was rather proud to be part of it. In time, the world outside the black community began to realize the true meaning of this silent gesture. In 2005, a statue was built of Smith and Carlos at San Jose State to commemorate the effect their bravery had on the world. The designer, Ricardo Guivier, left Norman off the podium so anyone could stand on his step. Norman loved this idea, adding that anybody can get up there and stand up for what they believe in. That just about says it all. In 2012, the Australian government issued a formal, though posthumous, apology to the sprinter.
I don't think we gave recognition to somebody who'd done so much to stand for racial equality.
Australia has now begun to see him as he truly is, a hero. These 3 brave men, in their solitary stance, helped the countries continue to push forward on the long, arduous march towards human rights. They stood up for something they believed in, bringing politics into the realm of athletics in a way that had never been done before. As President Obama proclaimed at the 2016 Olympics,
Their powerful silent protest in the 1968 Games was controversial, but it woke folks up and created greater opportunity for those that followed.
Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and Peter Norman became part of the most iconic images of the 20th century, inspiring generations of athletes for years to come. Their old coach, Tracy Walters, described the impact of their stance by stating,
"They helped the world take another look at racism."
In 2011, John Carlos expressed his support for the continuing fight against oppression around the world by declaring that all they want is what we wanted 43 years ago: dignity and an acknowledgement of our humanity.